What are the critical background issues preceding the NATO crisis in Iraq?
Well, there are two really interrelated questions, which were one, should there be a war in Iraq? That was the big issue, the big question, the one that divided the Allies, especially the United States on the one hand, and its old European allies such as Germany and France on the other hand. And there was a secondary question, which was what should be NATO's role, if any, in such a contingency. And of course, those who said that there should be no military intervention against Iraq, such as the Germans and the French, were saying there certainly should be no NATO role. But the US, of course, tried to bring in NATO as a way, in a sense, to circumvent that Franco-German opposition to the Iraq War.
Could you briefly explain how and to what extent NATO was involved during the Iraqi war and its aftermath?
Well, that's very simple. It was not. Because there was a rejection of such a role by major allies. NATO did not have an operational role in the operation in Iraq in March and April 2003. There was a limited, somewhat symbolic role in the sense that NATO deployed some assets, missiles and airplanes, to protect Turkey, a NATO member, against a possible Iraqi counterattack, which did not take place. And of course, this issue of Turkey was the key political issue in the NATO crisis. But other than that, there was no NATO role in the operation itself. There was discussion of a possible NATO role after the operation in terms of stabilizing and reconstructing Iraq. But of course, this never happened because Iraq became a very difficult situation very quickly.
During your presentation, you stated that the Iraqi crisis was not as existential as feared in 2003, but it was the end of a certain NATO. Could you please elaborate?
Yes. During the crisis in 2003, those who objected to the Franco-German opposition to a NATO role, and in fact opposition to a war in Iraq, were saying that this was a betrayal of the fundamentals of the Atlantic Alliance, which was solidarity against an external threat. By refusing to deploy NATO assets in the defense of Turkey, the French and the Germans, these people were saying, were in essence betraying Article 5, which is the key article of the NATO pact. But of course, this was a very excessive suggestion because there was no. The French and the Germans were certainly not against the defense of Turkey in the case of an attack against Turkey. They were only saying that they didn't want, by an active NATO role that would be precipitate, to justify in advance a decision to go to war against Iraq. So there was a very strong rhetoric at the time, but of course NATO survived because the essence of it was not at stake.